I'm Brad Wolf, and welcome to Dan. And I know this is last minute notice, but I will be in person at Cape Fear Games in Wilmington, North Carolina this Saturday, December 9th. And I'll be talking about how to prep adventures, both pre-made and homebrew adventures, how to build and start running your own games. So if you're a brand new DM or an experienced DM who just wants some additional tips and advice, so come on out, meet me in person. There'll be a Q&A at the end where you can ask whatever Dungeon Master or YouTube related questions you want. And there's a giveaway. If you're the first one to arrive and mention this video, you'll receive a print of the channel mascots, the Wizard and the Direwolf, drawn by my good friend Joe Covas. So if you're already on the North or South Carolina coast, it's not too far of a drive. Come on out, see me in Wilmington. Like I said, I'll be there December 9th from noon to about 2 o'clock, maybe 3 o'clock, depending on how many people want to hang out. Now let's dive into the Dire Dan. One of the first skills you need as a game master is the ability to prep an adventure. Almost every RPG you can purchase comes with a pre-written adventure, or that same publisher makes pre-written adventures for that game. So you need the ability to take what somebody else has written and make it your own. Be able to digest what they have laid out in order to prepare it and use it at your table with your friends. Now, the first tip is to read the adventure. And that might seem like an obvious first thing to do, but you just have to. You have to read it from front to back and digest most of it in at least one read through. And that might seem overwhelming when you're looking at something like this Descent into Avernus, which is set in Baldur's Gate. And if you play the Baldur's Gate game, you get the access to the whole city of Baldur's Gate with this adventure, which is pretty cool. But the adventure is a lot. It's a lot to read. And that's why for first-time DMs, I don't recommend you start with one of those full-length hardback adventure books by Wizards of the Coast. I would suggest shorter adventures like Lost Mine of Phandelver, Dragon of Icespire Peak, and Dragons of Stormwreck Isle, or anthology adventures like Tales of the Yawning Portal and Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel, or episodic adventures like Ghosts of Saltmarsh. First three adventures in Ghosts of Saltmarsh are directly connected to each other and take place chronologically one right after the other, but there's not a hard, fast plot that connects them, and the subsequent adventures are kind of loosely connected to those original three. So there's not a lot of work to do with pacing and story development in Ghosts of Saltmarsh like there are with the other big hardback adventures. And that just makes things easier on you as a DM. Now, what's really important to know here is that you don't have to thoroughly digest every aspect of this adventure on your first read-through. You don't have to memorize the whole thing. On your first read-through, you're just trying to get the general idea and the main concept of this adventure. So don't be overwhelmed by it all. So as you read through the adventure, that brings us to tip number 2. You want to look for important NPCs. You want to look for NPCs that will show up in the later chapters that have connections to the first chapter. So either they appear in that first chapter or somebody they know appears in that first chapter. So you're looking for important people or important creatures that you want to introduce as early as you can. And if you can't introduce them as early as possible, you can introduce people who know them as early as possible. So for example, in Dragons of Stormwreck Isle, there's a group of kobolds who are working with the main villain of the story. And you can meet a kobold named Mila in the first chapter of the adventure, and she's a good-natured kobold and is a friendly NPC. However, both her brother and sister are working for the main villain. So introducing Mila is a way to foreshadow, kind of pre-introduce her siblings and how they are connected to the villain of the story. So those are the type of connections you're looking for when you do your thorough read-through of the adventure. Like I said, you're not trying to digest and understand everything about the adventure when you read it through the first time. You're just looking for important connections so that when you build your first chapter, you're doing it with an eye towards the future. Tip number 3 is look for player character hooks. Now, some adventures make this very easy for you because they come with pre-generated characters, and those pre-generated characters come with attached plot hooks. Or the adventure gives you suggestions on plot hooks that you can feed the characters. Now, if you're running an older adventure or some independent adventures, they might not provide those things. So be looking for NPCs that would make good connections for character backstories. Then in session 0 or session 1, make those connections to the player characters. So a player might show up and not want to use a pre-generated character. So they might make their own character during session 0, and then you can suggest certain things while they are making up their backstory. And you can look for opportunities to connect what the player is coming up with for their character background to the plot of the adventure, either by taking the backgrounds that come with the pre-generated characters and tweaking them to fit the concept that the player is coming up with for their own character, or taking the player's idea of what their backstory is and looking for ways to connect that to important places or NPCs in the adventure that you've pre-read. So now that you've read the adventure all the way through, you've looked for important NPCs, and you've looked for player character hooks, now it's time to go back and reread Chapter 1 as thoroughly as you can. Now this is the time that you do want to digest and memorize as much as possible. So if you're going to spend your energy really digging into this adventure, do it with Chapter 1. Really get to know that chapter so you can build a strong start for your first couple of sessions. Then that brings us to tip number 5, decide on your playstyle. Are you going to run this adventure with maps and miniatures, or are you going to run this adventure completely theater of the mind? Or are you going to do some sort of combination of the two? The third one is the one I highly recommend. There are some combats that you're probably going to want miniatures and a map for, and there'll be other encounters that are better run theater of the mind. But either way, whatever you decide, if you want to do the whole thing theater of the mind, then go back through Chapter 1 and figure out how you're going to plan those encounters in a way that you can run them in theater of the mind. Go back through Chapter 1 and figure out how you're going to run those encounters with just your description and your imaginations, and how you're going to evoke the images and the scenes in the player's imaginations. So if you're using maps and miniatures, you want to figure out how you're going to draw them on your dry erase mat, or you're going to download them for the VTT that you're using. However you're going to do it, come up with a plan for it so that you can implement it. And that brings us to step number 6. Determine the connections from Chapter 1 to Chapter 2. Come up with how you're going to present the transition from first chapter to second chapter. Some adventures do a really good job of spelling that out for you, and others don't. So you might have to think a minute and kind of look at Chapter 1 and look at Chapter 2 and figure out how you're going to connect two parts of those stories. So now that's enough to start playing. Once you've done these first 6 steps, you can sit down with your players and do your session 0, and you can have your session 1, and then you see how much of Chapter 1 you complete during session 1. And then that might continue into session 2 or session 3 as you finish Chapter 1 and make those connections to Chapter 2. And that brings us to our last step, which is repeat steps 4, 5, and 6 for each subsequent chapter as you go through the adventure. So after you finish Chapter 1 and make your connections to Chapter 2, then you're going to do a deep dive read of Chapter 2 and plan your connections to Chapter 3, and so on. Now, I hope that demystifies this process, because it really is pretty straightforward. The hardest part is that original read-through in step 1. And then you just follow these steps and plan it out accordingly. And you don't have to have it all planned out from the beginning. You just have to know enough so that you can really do a good job in Chapter 1. And then after that, you start to build Chapter 2 and then Chapter 3 and so forth and so on. And it's not nearly as complicated as you might think it would be. So I hope you find all that helpful. And again, if you're in the Wilmington area this weekend, December 9th, come by on Saturday and see me at Cape Fear Games. I'd love to meet you in person, and we can talk more about your games and your ideas and any tips or tricks that you have, or any specific advice that you want to know. And thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time in the Dire Day.